In the attic of a forgotten house in rural Bavaria, a young couple found a sealed crate, no markings, no key, just a date scorched into the wood, 1943. Inside wasn't treasure or relic, but a journal filled with madness, a child's name repeated like prayer, and a device no one could explain. It didn't tick, it didn't move, but some say it listened. And when they opened it, something began to wake. Before we step further into the silence that settled over Eichenwald and follow the trail left by a vanished scientist, a girl who may never have lived, and the machine that should never have been found, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep unearthing the stories time tried to bury, the ones sealed behind false walls, etched in forgotten journals, and humming softly beneath the floorboards. Every subscription helps keep these echoes from fading, keeps their names from being erased by dust and denial. What you do here may seem quiet, but to the voices still waiting to be heard, it's everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. The attic had not been touched in decades. Long fingers of cobwebs clung to beams that sagged under the slow pressure of time. And the air was thick with a smell both metallic and earthy, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for 80 years. Light from the afternoon sun filtered through a crack in the slate tiles, casting a shifting lattice across the dust-mottled floor. Lena brushed her hand along a crumbling rafter, the wood brittle beneath her touch. Her husband, Matthias, stood near the far corner, where the wall didn't match the others. Plaster over rough wood, newer than the rest. His hammer struck at once just enough to confirm what they already suspected. Hollow. It was Lena who first noticed the mark. Not the crate itself, but the impression of it, where decades of dust ended in a sharp outline. As if the thing had waited there, untouched and unseen, even by mice. When they pulled the false wall away, the air shifted. Something old woke up. The crate stood no higher than a suitcase, but it dominated the space with the quiet weight of something that had outlived its era. Iron bands circled its edges, rust blooming along the seams. No hinges, no handles, no lock that they could see, and yet it remained sealed shut, unmoved by effort. Burned into one side, in deliberate, even script, was a single date, 1943. No name. No insignia, no clue to origin. Lena tilted her head as she studied it, and for a moment, she swore she could smell fire. They brought it downstairs. The rest of the house, stripped down for renovations, was bare save for plastic sheeting and the echo of their steps. They placed the crate on a workbench, its weight surprising far heavier than the size suggested. Matthias fetched tools, crowbars, pliers, even a chisel. Metal rang against metal, but the crate held firm, as if it resisted the world on principle. Later, they would tell friends that they should have left it alone. That the crate belonged to the attic, and the attic belonged to another time. But that night, curiosity turned to something quieter, colder. Lena woke to a sound faint, like paper crinkling. Like breath behind the walls. The crate sat in the living room, unmoved, and yet the silence around it had changed. When it finally gave way under strain and a hairline fracture, they didn't celebrate. They just stared. Inside was no treasure, no wartime artifact of monetary value. Just a bundle of leather-bound papers, warped with age. Photographs curled at the corners, their edges singed. And an object. Small, circular. Roughly the size of a compass, but unlike anything they had seen before. It was cold to the touch. At the bottom, folded beneath layers of parchment and mold-worn cloth, lay a name. Not on a label, not etched in metal, but scribbled in a hurried hand across the back of a torn schematic. Voigt. They didn't know it yet, but they had unearthed something meant to be forgotten. Something buried not just beneath wood and time, but beneath silence, deliberate, heavy, terrified silence. And silence, once disturbed, has a way of echoing. In the gray corridors of Germany's wartime science divisions, few names carried as much whispered awe and unease as Dr. Albrecht Voigt. He was never photographed publicly, never awarded, never quoted in the grand speeches that lauded the Third Reich's scientific might. And yet, behind closed doors, his influence rippled like a shadow across projects too obscure or too dangerous for open recognition. He was only 35 when he vanished. But already there were those who called him the mind that bent time, or tried to. Born in Leipzig to a dying father and a mother who spoke in riddles, Voigt had grown up in silence. His teachers described a child who answered before questions were finished, who stared too long at clock faces, who once tore apart a music box not to see how it worked, but to see what it remembered. By the time the war swallowed Europe, Voigt had long since abandoned conventional physics. He'd turned his focus inward into the mind, into the pulse of memory, and deeper still, into what he called the layers beneath presentness. His writings were cryptic, sometimes unreadable, yet chillingly precise when decoded. To Voigt, time was not a line, but a bruise. By 1941, he had been absorbed into a classified wing of the Reich's military research complex, working under a project name that appears only once in declassified files: Echo Protocol. The details of the project remain missing, presumed destroyed in a fire that also consumed part of the records office at the Reich Ministry of Science. What little survives is second-hand. Testimonies from colleagues who spoke of a device, small, elegant, sealed. Not a weapon, but something worse. Something that, according to one unnamed engineer, changed the room when it was present. Then, in November 1943, Voigt disappeared. His lab was found in disarray. Not destroyed, just abandoned mid-thought. Equipment still humming, notes scattered. A coffee cup half full, the liquid still warm when guards entered the room. No blood, no struggle, just a missing man and a final log entry. She is more stable now. The signal holds longer. But the song won't stop. The official story issued weeks later claimed sabotage, enemy agents, a betrayal from within. But no arrests were made, no trials held. The report was filed and forgotten, stamped with a classification that would outlive the Reich itself. In the years that followed, his name became a ghost in the archives, a reference point for anomalies, a redacted sentence where a theory should be. His family received no body, no grave, just a letter thanking them for their son's sacrifice and warning them never to speak of it. But there were whispers. Among Allied intelligence intercepts, fragments of radio chatter hinted at something left behind in the Bavarian countryside. A prototype, a test subject. Some said Voigt had refused to hand over his final designs. That he'd seen something through his machine, something that made him burn the blueprints and flee into hiding. Others believed he had succeeded. That he had broken through, peeled back time's skin, and what he saw was so unbearable, he chose to vanish rather than bring it into the world. Of all the men who shaped the hidden machinery of that war, Voigt was the only one whose disappearance created a silence that still feels active, as if waiting. Not a closed book, but a page held between fingers, paused mid-turn. The journal was the first thing they touched, its leather cover warped and brittle. The clasp rusted shut until it cracked beneath careful pressure. Inside, the ink had bled in places, the handwriting shifting from elegant loops to jagged, fevered scrawl as the pages advanced. It wasn't a record of events, not in the way one might expect from a man of science. It read more like a confession, but one so fragmented that meaning surfaced only in glimmers, like shapes beneath murky water. Dates appeared sporadically. Some were scratched out. Others repeated, again and again. October 14, 1943. The past, it seemed, had begun looping for Dr. Albrecht Voigt. Entries in the early pages were filled with scientific notations, formulae, notes on wave behavior, references to auditory resonance, mnemonic thresholds, and unfamiliar units of measurement. But even here, something felt off. The precision one would expect from a physicist or engineer gave way to metaphor. The sound remembers. She responds to harmonics but resists order. The machine does not measure time, it listens to it. Phrases repeated, like obsessions or incantations. And then came the name. Emily. Photographs were tucked between pages, each one curling at the corners, their surfaces blistered by heat or chemical exposure. Most showed dimly lit rooms, some medical, some makeshift lined with wires and unfamiliar instruments. In one, a shadowy figure stands at the edge of the frame, coat buttoned to the neck, head turned away. Another showed a child's silhouette near a large cylindrical apparatus, the film degraded just enough to obscure the face. But it was the drawing that stilled the breath in Lena's throat, a child's crayon sketch, crude and violent in its strokes. A little girl, stick-thin, standing beside a large box with wires coming out of it. Around them, in red and black, dozens of crude X's, like crosses on a battlefield. The deeper into the papers they went, the more chaotic the material became. Schematics bled into diary entries. One note, dated just days before Voight's disappearance, was scrawled in the margin of a blueprint. The echo strengthens after midnight. She speaks clearest in reverse. I must adjust the coil. The blueprint itself detailed a compact device, circular, with concentric rings etched into the metal casing. Notations marked parts as memory gates, resonance locks, and a component ominously labeled die Schluss, the sluice or the gate. At the bottom of the crate, beneath a cracked lining of rotted velvet, lay the device, cold, dense, and sealed tight. No hinges, no visible means of activation. It resembled a warped pocket watch, but there was no glass, no hands. Only a series of thin grooves running across its face, like the rings of a tree or the score of a vinyl record. Holding it induced a strange sensation, not pain, not heat, but a kind of tension, like standing at the edge of a thunderstorm and feeling the charge gather in the air. When investigators later examined the device, they found no electronic components, no batteries, no wires. It was as though it had been designed not to function in any conventional sense, but to contain. Whatever it was built for, it was now inert or dormant. Still, no one held it for long. There was a hum, faint and fleeting, almost imagined. But enough. As experts combed through the journal and artifacts, a pattern began to surface, like a hidden melody stitched into the static. Voight had not simply been experimenting with sound or time. He had been recording something, preserving it, maybe even trying to shield the world from it. Guilt bled through the entries like oil through fabric. He had done something, or failed to undo it. Again and again, one phrase returned: she won't let go. And neither, it seemed, would the past. Eichenwald sat nestled in the folds of Bavarian countryside, like a secret folded into paper. It was the kind of town you might pass through without noticing wood smoke drifting from chimneys, shutters closed even on sunny days, the church bell slow to toll. Time moved differently there, not out of charm but reluctance. Streets narrowed into cobbled paths that led nowhere, and signs bore names no longer listed on maps. It was a place that survived the war by forgetting it, and whatever it couldn't forget, it buried. When the investigators arrived, there was no welcome. The locals watched from behind curtains, eyes unreadable. The bakery, the post office, the Gasthaus, none had records of a man named Voigt. No mention in birth registries, no property deeds. And yet, when the name was spoken, something shifted in the air. A dog barked in the distance, a door closed too quickly. Denial came not from ignorance, but from practiced silence. An elderly woman tending graves at the edge of the old cemetery was the first to speak, though not directly. She never used his name. There was one, she said, her fingers brushing moss from a crooked headstone. He lived near the sanatorium, or under it, never saw him by daylight. The soldiers came at night, never stayed long, drove trucks that didn't make engine sounds, just humming. Her voice faltered. He wasn't like the others. He didn't salute. The sanatorium itself stood at the outskirts of town, half swallowed by the forest. Its western wing was nothing more than a scorched skeleton now, stone and ash, devoured by fire long ago. No one rebuilt it. No one even fenced it off. Weeds crept through fractured tiles, and the charred walls bore black stains that rain couldn't wash away. Local legend claimed the fire started without spark, that the walls wept tar before they burned. Children were warned not to go near, not because it was dangerous, but because it remembered. Inside the main hall, behind layers of mildew and peeled paint, investigators found remnants, scraps of wire embedded in the plaster, metal brackets fastened to the floor as if something had once been bolted down, large and heavy. A chalkboard still hung crooked, its last markings faint but visible. Wave patterns, strange sigils, and a phrase written in neat German script, Die Rückkehr braucht Stille. Return requires silence. Attempts to interview residents yielded little more than evasions and parables. A retired machinist spoke in riddles. He could hear what the metal remembered, he said, refusing to elaborate. A former nurse at the sanatorium, now blind, sat silently until she was asked about the girl. Then her mouth trembled. "Emily?" she whispered. "No, that name doesn't belong here." When asked if she'd seen her, the woman simply turned her face to the wall and began to hum. There were no records, no blueprints of the burned wing, no mention of Voigt's residence in the town's archives. And yet, everyone seemed to know exactly what had been lost, even if they refused to say it aloud. The past hung like fog, clinging to the clothes of those who stayed too long. It became clear, then, that Eichenwald had not forgotten Dr. Albrecht Voigt. It had chosen to. The way a body seals a wound, not to heal, but to keep the infection from spreading. Something had happened in those woods, in those rooms beneath the sanatorium floors. And the town, in its quiet, stubborn way, had done what it could to survive it by pretending it had never happened at all. She appeared first as a whisper, one photograph, tucked behind a folded blueprint stained with age and mildew. A child no older than 8, hair pinned back, eyes wide and solemn as if the camera had caught her mid-thought. Her dress was plain, the hem uneven. Her hands were folded in front of her, fingers curled tightly inward. The background was indistinct, a dark curtain, perhaps, or the wall of a cellar. The only writing on the back, in a firm but trembling hand, was one word, Emily. There was no surname, no date. Just that name, echoing through the journal in strange repetition. Voigt mentioned her in fragmented entries that blurred the line between science and obsession. She laughed today. I don't know how, she shouldn't remember joy. Elsewhere, her shadow was wrong again, slower than her feet. The entries never clarified her place in his life. No note of a wife, no record of a child. But Emily was everywhere, traced in the margins, named in desperation, tied to the experiments that slowly eroded his sanity. The more they read, the more her presence warped. At first, Voigt wrote of her like a father, affection wrapped in a clinical tone, protectiveness buried under layers of calculation. Test #3 stabilized her heartbeat. Memory flickered at 11:32. Test #7 failed. Emily cried again. I shouldn't have let her hear it. And then, abruptly, the language shifted. It's not her. It remembers her. But it's not her. The journal turned inward after that, the entries descending into madness or revelation. She's a loop. I built a loop. She doesn't age because I never let her. Investigators pored over every document, trying to place Emily in Voigt's life. No birth certificate, no school records, no photographs in public archives. Not a single trace of her outside that one image, and the increasingly feverish pages of the journal. But the way Voigt wrote about her so intimately, so obsessively, it was impossible to believe she was invented. At least, not entirely. One blueprint, marked ER, -9, included a diagram labeled Emily, Memory Matrix. It resembled a neural map, but distorted, recursive, a loop feeding into itself. Notes surrounding the diagram referenced sound triggers, emotional anchors, and something called temporal drift compensation. It became clear that Voight hadn't just tried to preserve her. He had tried to reconstruct her. There were hints, too, of loss. A letter never sent, folded and stained, addressed only to "My dearest E." In it, a single paragraph. "I still hear your song. I've etched it into copper and bone, built chambers that hum your name. But each version slips further from you. You look back at me through the shell, but it's not you. Not yet. If I can fix you, I can fix everything. I must." That line appeared again and again in the final pages of the journal. A litany, a curse. If I can fix her, I can fix everything. Theories bloomed. Some believed Emily had died, and Voight, unable to bear it, had used his experiments to anchor a version of her in time. Others suggested she was never real at all, an embodiment of guilt, of obsession, the child he never had but always needed. But the photograph remains, real, tangible. A girl staring through time with eyes too aware for a child, too quiet for a ghost. And somewhere within the broken pages, beneath equations and regret, Voight's voice whispered to her still, not in love, not in madness, but in the hope that memory, if wound tight enough, could somehow hold back the tide. The device was smaller than expected, fitting easily into the palm of a hand, cold and unnervingly smooth. Its surface was unlike any metal on record, dull, but not aged, unmarred by rust or oxidation, despite the decades sealed in the crate. Circular, with no obvious mechanism, it looked almost decorative at first glance. But the grooves etched into its face formed no identifiable language, only a series of repeating arcs and intersecting lines. When the team at the private research facility first examined it, they dismissed it as inert, a broken relic, perhaps a casing, a shell of something that once held purpose. But the more time they spent in proximity to it, the more that assumption began to unravel. The anomalies started subtly. An analog clock in the observation room began running backward slowly at first, its second hand ticking with stubborn resistance as if pulled by something unseen. Electrical interference followed. Static on intercoms, lights dimming in rhythmic pulses. But it was the magnetic field readings that raised alarms. Unprompted, the device began emitting soft but irregular bursts, strong enough to disrupt nearby instruments, yet undetectable by most conventional sensors. It wasn't broadcasting, exactly, it was resonating. They moved it into isolation, surrounding it with Faraday cages, lead lining, even placing it within vacuum chambers to nullify environmental variables. Still, nothing stopped the pulses. A physicist noted that the interference wasn't random. It followed a pattern peaks that aligned with certain frequencies, almost like a melody etched into space. When played back as sound, the result was chilling. Not noise, not code, but something eerily close to a lullaby. A sleep researcher brought in to monitor neural responses to the pattern experienced an unexpected reaction. During one overnight session, she awoke in tears, claiming she'd heard footsteps crunching through snow. Then a faint, persistent ticking, and finally, a girl humming just outside her dreams. EEG data confirmed heightened theta wave activity associated with deep dreaming. Yet she hadn't fully entered REM sleep. She wasn't dreaming. She was hearing. The team grew divided. Some insisted it was nothing more than a sophisticated recording device, an experimental black box or memory vault, perhaps designed to capture emotional states through frequency. Others, more cautious, suggested something darker. The device didn't record memories, it held them. Locked within its core, compressed beyond current understanding, was something not entirely mechanical. One technician, after repeated contact with the object, refused to enter the lab again. He claimed he had seen a room, dimly lit, with a child's voice looping the same broken phrase in German. Ich bin noch hier. I'm still here. Attempts to dismantle the device were quickly abandoned. A micro-drill fractured after briefly touching the surface, as if the material resisted violation on a molecular level. When ultrasonic imaging was attempted, the machinery failed mid-scan and refused to power on again. The scans they did recover revealed something unexpected. Internal cavities, perfectly symmetrical, and something else, something warm. There was no power source, no circuitry, and yet, the device seemed to listen. It was passive, yes, but never truly dormant, as if waiting for a signal, or a voice, or a key long since lost. When they sealed it away once more, placing it under armed storage, a final test was conducted. An analog film reel run near its surface. The footage returned altered. Not glitched. Rewritten. The final frames showed a hallway of cracked tile, and just before the end, the corner of a small figure disappearing from view. Whatever it was recording, container, or echo the device, had never truly stopped functioning. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen. The last entry began like the others, measured and methodical, though the ink told a different story. It was darker, pressed too hard against the paper, as if written in panic. The date December 3, 1943, was underlined twice, the only instance in the entire journal where Voigt emphasized time. Beneath it, his handwriting trembled but remained legible. They are coming. I buried the rest in the walls. They must not find her. I have made a terrible error. There are voices in the steel now. I see her even when I close my eyes. And then, abruptly, the line cut off mid-sentence, trailing into a single downward stroke that faded into nothing. The next page was blank except for the faint imprint of that pressure, as if the pen had dug into the paper long after the ink had run dry. The page that followed bore a stain dark, uneven, soaked through from the edge inward. Forensic tests decades later confirmed it was organic, most likely blood, though too old to identify a source. The blood had pooled at the bottom of the page before drying, suggesting Voigt hadn't been writing when it fell. He had been holding the journal upright. Perhaps he was reading the words back to himself when it happened. The pages before that final entry were different from the rest. They had grown erratic, unmoored from reason. Paragraphs began to circle the same idea. She is in the walls now. The signal repeats even with the power cut. She doesn't breathe, but the air bends around her. The handwriting alternated between near-perfect precision and near illegibility, as though two versions of the same man were fighting for control of the pen. He wrote of sounds that traveled through metal beams, of echoes that carried words not his own. When I touch the steel, he wrote, I hear her laugh, then the laughter splits. I cannot tell which is hers anymore. Investigators reconstructed what they could of his final hours. Records from the facility confirmed an unscheduled security alert that night. Power fluctuations. A short-lived fire in the West Wing, reported extinguished within minutes. No body was recovered. The logs were later altered, several pages missing, entire paragraphs redacted. But one guard's statement, found decades later in the margins of a confiscated notebook, offered a single line. He told her to stay quiet, then the air cracked like glass. The journal itself bore subtle signs of heat exposure along the edges, suggesting it had survived a fire. The faint smell of copper lingered in its spine, the same metallic tang described by those who handled the device years later. That connection could not be ignored. Whatever Voigt had done, whatever he had built had reached the point of convergence on that day. Some believed he was killed by his own invention, consumed by the forces he attempted to control. Others argued that the blood belonged to someone else, perhaps Emily, perhaps another victim of his experiments. The absence of evidence only deepened the myth. But there was one final anomaly, buried beneath the text, invisible until ultraviolet light was applied. Faintly etched into the margin beside his last line, in handwriting far smaller than the rest, were 5 words. She knows I tried to stop. After that, nothing. Silence. The remaining pages were untouched, crisp, waiting. It was as if the journal itself had been abandoned mid-breath. The story paused rather than ended. In that stillness, the reader feels Voight's presence linger, the weight of guilt, of fear, of something that had already begun to escape the page. The voice in the steel, the girl behind the echo, the experiment that had crossed its threshold. December 3, 1943, was the moment the scientist vanished. But perhaps, in some quiet corner of that decaying sanatorium, something else began to speak in his place. They returned to the attic, with the journal open to the page circled in red pencil, a hastily drawn floor plan, annotated with fragmented instructions. North beam hollow, west corner false. Voight had left a map, not in any deliberate sense, but through layered desperation. Scattered drawings, phrases that once seemed poetic, now read as coordinates. With crowbars and gloved hands, they began to tear away the walls. Dust choked the air, thick with the rot of insulation, the breath of old timber. Behind one panel, they found a hollow, its edges blackened by fire long extinguished. Inside, the first discovery. A scorched porcelain doll, its glass eyes cracked, a jaw melted into a permanent, silent scream. Beside it, another, then another. Dolls burned in places where no flame should have reached. Further in, beneath the floorboards, a box wrapped in oiled cloth emerged. It creaked as they opened it, revealing a music box carved from dark wood, its crank still intact. When wound, it played a lullaby, slow and broken. The tune was almost familiar, but something was off, as if the melody had been bent. Its notes stretched too far, pulled through a tunnel of time. The mechanism groaned, notes slipping like voices underwater. Then came the voice, faint, not mechanical. A child's hum, weaving into the tune. They let it play only once. Beneath the music box were reels of film, labeled in Voight's hand. Subject E, Session 1, Echo Trial #4, and finally, Zurich : the last was underlined 3 times. Carefully, they fed the reels into a restored projector in the local archives vault, the kind of place built to preserve what history once forgotten. The footage flickered to life in fits and starts. Light bled across the screen. No sound, at first, only the click of the reel. In the first reel, Emily sat in a chair too large for her. Her eyes darted to something off-screen, lips moving, but the film had no audio. The room around her was bare, except for wires draped like vines across the floor, leading to a machine just out of frame. In one looped section, her head tilts slowly to the side, and her mouth begins to move again, only now. The footage reversed itself without warning, then stuttered, then played forward again, creating a disorienting effect. Emily speaking backward, her gestures repeating, then warping. Her eyes never blinked. Another reel showed a dark corridor, likely beneath the sanatorium. A figure appeared briefly in the distance, but the frame distorted each time it neared the lens. The final frames flickered too quickly to parse until slowed down, revealing symbols scratched into walls, and a word, painted in childlike handwriting across a sheet, Zurich. The word returned again and again, scratched into the wood behind walls, etched on film cans, whispered through the cracks in Voight's journal. To bring back, it wasn't a command, it was a purpose. A drive that had consumed him. To rewind time, not as a concept, but as an action. To retrieve something the universe had already taken. When they resealed the attic, they did so quietly. There was no press conference, no announcement, just the soft, shared agreement among those who had seen the reels and read the words. Whatever Voight had hidden was never meant to be found. And Amélie, whatever remained of her, had not been left behind. She had been placed there, preserved, caught between frames of a film that never ended, waiting for the final spool to play. The house in Eichenwald stands quiet again. The scaffolding is gone, the dust swept clean, and the walls repainted in neutral tones by the new owners, who will never know what once stirred behind the attic's timber bones. The young couple who uncovered the crate left the town only weeks after the final discovery, offering no explanation. They didn't sell the house, they simply walked away. Their names remain on the property deed, but their forwarding address was never provided. Neighbors recall seeing the woman outside one night, staring up at the attic window as snow began to fall. She stayed there for almost an hour, unmoving, lips parted, as though she were listening. The crate was removed under the cover of early morning. No markings on the truck, no insignias on the men who carried it, just gloved hands and measured steps. The archivists left no documents behind. When pressed for information, even local officials were told only that the material had been reclassified, as if truth were a type of contaminant that required quarantine. The device itself was taken separately, in a lead-lined case, its whereabouts unknown. Not even the agency that originally requested its testing was informed. It was decided quietly, collectively, that some questions were not meant to be answered. The attic has since been sealed, not boarded or locked, but welded. A metal plate covers the entrance now, installed without permission, without record of who ordered the work. Tools left nearby by the renovation crew rusted overnight, their metal streaked with a fine black residue. A new light bulb, screwed in a week later, shattered the first time it was turned on. Since then, no one has entered. The space above the house remains untouched, its silence heavy. But there are stories. A neighbor's daughter claims she heard music on a windless night, notes carried faintly on the snow. A lullaby, broken and slow. She couldn't place the melody, but it made her cry without understanding why. An elderly man walking his dog near the woods behind the property swears he saw footprints appear in the fresh snow, small ones, spaced like a child's, leading from the tree line to the back steps. No one was there when he turned a corner. Only the sound of something tapping gently from above, like fingers brushing old glass. Those who knew of Voigt's work have gone silent, retired, or vanished entirely from the academic record. His notes were copied, but the originals charred, smudged, marked by symbols no one has translated, were never seen again. The films are sealed, the reels housed in a vault where no viewing is permitted. Even the lullaby, once digitized, was corrupted before it could be archived. The file name remains, but the sound is gone. When played, it emits only a low thrum, like breath caught between walls. What becomes of memory when it is refused closure? What becomes of grief when it's given shape, circuit, and sound? Voigt tried to answer that question, and in doing so, created something that could not be dismissed as myth. Something that defied the laws he once trusted. He believed in preservation, in recovery, in building a bridge backward through time. But the thing about bridges is this: once crossed, they are not always meant to be rebuilt. In the end, not everything lost can be restored. Some absences are too vast, some echoes too deep. What Voigt tried to bring back may have never fully left. And what remains locked in film, in steel, in silence, is not a return, but a haunting. And when the snow falls, covering the earth like ash, the attic above Eichenwald remembers. Not with words, not with light, but with a hum that slips beneath the floorboards, quiet as breath. The kind of sound you only hear when you're alone, when you're listening too closely, when you're remembering something you were never meant to know.